The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Pat Garofalo on an antitrust agenda for working people. Chuck Collins on his newest book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions, plus Bill Press with Kentucky Congressman John Yarmuth, chair of the House Budget Committee, on what it will take to pass Biden's infrastructure plan. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In a recent report, the Economic Liberties Project offers a roadmap to how the Biden administration can reverse a corporate concentration crisis. Pat Garofalo says there is a growing sense across the political divide that this is an issue lawmakers need to confront. And we say hello to Pat Garofalo, Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's also the author of The Billionaire Boondoggle, How Our Politicians Let Corporations and Bigwigs Steal Our Money and Jobs. Pat Garofalo, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. So why don't we start off, Pat, have you just tell us a little bit about the Economic Liberties Project and why it exists?
Yeah, totally. The American Economic Liberties Project launched a little over a year ago with the broad mandate of reducing corporate power and promoting public power. We hold the view, and I think it's very well backed up by data, numbers, and just the everyday lived experience of plenty of Americans, that corporations have way too much power over our economic system, over our governmental system, and that's bad for workers, that's bad for democracy, and there are ways to fix it. There's a long tradition in U.S. history of the government stepping in to regulate corporations, to reduce their power, to promote the public interest, but that's largely been forgotten over the last 30 years. Over the last several decades, there's been this move to be extremely deferential to corporate interests, to allow them to self-regulate, to let them do largely whatever they want in the name of economic efficiency and consumer prices. And that's just been really bad for most Americans.
Now, in February, your organization issued a report. We've got a bit of a long name, so bear with me, folks. It's titled, right? It is, but worth talking about. So the title of this report: Democratizing Markets: How the Biden Administration Can Advance an Antitrust and Competition Policy Agenda for Working People, Independent Businesses, and Resilient Communities. And it begins with a powerful statement that, quote, concentrated economic power has reached extreme proportions in virtually every sector of the economy, close quote. So, Pat, what are some of the ways this is being felt in the average American's life?
This is everywhere. The corporate concentration problem over the last 30 to 40 years has gotten extremely serious. And like we said, in nearly every sector of the economy, you basically can't find an industry where this isn't a problem in one way or the other. If you look at big ag, where just a few companies are responsible for all of the meat and chicken that you eat. If you look at airlines, where they're just a handful, and they're all colluding and cutting off each other's sharing routes and raising fees together. You look at pharmaceuticals, where it's just a few companies hold sway over everybody's medication. You look at retail, where once upon a time there was a thriving independent retail section in this country, and now it's largely Amazon, Walmart, Target, and big box stores. So you can see this everywhere, not just in those big headline industries, but also in smaller things. Like the funeral industry is getting rolled up by just a few companies, and that's why funeral costs are increasing. So it's almost everywhere you look. We call this the illusion of choice. When folks go into a store, they look at like soup on the grocery store aisle. It looks like there are a lot of brands and a lot of choices there, but once you actually dig into the details, it turns out that all of those brands, all of those companies are actually held in just a few hands by just a few large umbrella organizations, and that just happens in sector sector after sector after sector, almost everywhere you look.
It's funny as you're talking about that, and I'm thinking, even walking through the cereal aisle, and you have hundreds and hundreds of different boxes of cereals, but how many different companies make all those hundreds of different,
basically three. Yeah.
Right. It's not that many. And it's almost as if they're staying just shy of monopoly status. Is that
in a lot of cases it is monopoly status, and like I said earlier, there had been a long tradition in America of preventing that sort of concentration of regulators and antitrust enforcers stepping in and saying, no, you can't do that. The idea of one company holding 50, 60, 70% of a market was absurd, back through American history until very recently, relatively speaking.
Yeah. Now, the report states that there is, quote, increased recognition on both sides of the aisle that corporate consolidation is a political and economic threat to our democracy, close quote. But what is it that lawmakers are beginning to understand, and really, how far across the aisle is this actually extending?
Yeah, so something really important happened last year. The House Antitrust Subcommittee put out a giant report on concentration in digital markets, which is a fancy way of talking about the internet. So this is the power that Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple hold over our lives and over commerce on the internet. It was the largest monopoly investigation that Congress has done in about 50 years. It was really serious. They looked at millions of documents. They put out this long report talking about how some of these firms need to be broken up, how there need to be much stronger rules against mergers and acquisitions in that sector. And some of those recommendations did earn some bipartisan support in the House. There are some House Republicans who are willing to get on board with some of that. And I'm sure you've seen and probably talked about, there has been an increasing turn against big tech companies in some quarters of the conservative world. So don't want to go too wild here. It's necessarily not a consensus on that side of the aisle. It's not a consensus on the Democratic side of the aisle either. And a lot of the animus towards big tech in conservative circles is driven by charges of censorship and things like that, which don't actually hold sway, but they're at least going in the right direction. So I don't want to get exaggerate too much. It's not like there's a lockstep bipartisan march for this, but there are good signs on both sides of the aisle that this is a problem worth taking seriously. And I think that the experience of a lot of folks during the pandemic has contributed to this. I've certainly experienced this in my work, a growing recognition of the power that companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook have, because we've all been forced to interact with them so much. And we've seen the sort of profits they've been making while also looking down the street and seeing our small businesses closing and struggling. And so I think that dichotomy has become very real for folks during the pandemic in a way that it maybe wasn't before.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Pat Garofalo, Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's also the author of The Billionaire Boondoggle: How Our Politicians Let Corporations and Bigwigs Steal Our Money and Jobs. And Pat, what's your sense of the interest within the Biden administration to take on corporate concentration?
It's promising so far. They've made some very good appointments to a few positions that make it look like they're at least interested in tackling this problem, and that they're planning to take it seriously in one way or another. It's obviously really early days, and they're obviously dealing with many, many things. But the fact that they've made some really promising nominations, they named a guy named Tim Wu to the National Economic Council, who's been very vocal in favor of breakups of big tech. They nominated a woman named Lena Khan to the Federal Trade Commission, who has been a groundbreaking writer and analyst and researcher and legal mind on Amazon, the particular harms of Amazon. So it's encouraging so far. Obviously, it's the job of folks like us and yourself and everybody who's listening to this to keep their feet to the fire and to keep them on it. But there's at least the spark of interest, which I find very promising.
Now, the report has a long list of recommendations. In fact, if you thought that title was long, you should see the list of recommendations for the Biden administration. And there are a little few too many to go through for today, but let's focus on the ones that could make the biggest impact on workers. Under the heading titled Labor, you recommend targeting concentrated power among employers. How can that be done?
Yeah, this is actually an interesting aspect of the monopoly problem because it's called technically monopsony, which means buyer power, wherein corporations have the power to dictate wages because there aren't enough employers, right? If you think about the most efficient way for a worker to get a raise, right, is to threaten to go to some other firm that's going to pay them more, right? And to go and say, hey, boss, you gotta pay up or I'm heading down the street. With fewer and fewer employers available, that doesn't happen. So employers are really able to dictate. So simply breaking up large firms and introducing competition into several sectors could, in theory, increase worker power. But there are also other steps. There are things like banning non-compete agreements, which prevent workers from moving from job to job or from taking their knowledge from job to job. Banning things. Excuse me. Hopefully you can edit that bit out as I hiccup in the middle of my sentence. And there are things the Department of Labor can do to address the power that workers hold, whether it's giving gig workers more power to negotiate with their companies and make sure that they don't get misclassified. There are just several steps that the Biden administration could in theory take and that Congress could in theory take to ensure that workers have more bargaining power against their employers.
You mentioned the gig workers and the potential misclassification and how to prevent it. So how does that get done? Because that's a big part of our labor sector now.
Absolutely. The Department of Labor could step in and issue rules to clarify who is and is not and considered an employee for purposes of benefits and pay and all that good stuff. As I'm sure you've seen, there's been a concerted push amongst air quote gig economy workers, companies rather, to misclassify workers, to try and find ways to push costs down onto workers, whether that's drivers paying for their cars or whatever the case may be. The Biden administration could, in theory, issue rules to cut down on that. And states could also step in and do the same thing, state governments. You probably talked about the Prop 22 in California, which we view as hugely problematic. It was a rule that essentially makes it impossible for rideshare drivers to become full employees and to not just bargain collectively with their employer, but to also seek redress through the legislation. That law made it so that any changes to that referendum, made it so that any changes to the law require a supermajority of the California legislature. And so when I talked earlier about this being both an economic and a democratic problem, that's what I'm talking about. This was large companies coming in, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to buy labor law, and not just to change the law in their favor, but to make it that much harder for folks to then go back and alter the law through the democratic process. So this was bad on economic grounds, but also on democratic grounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as I mentioned before, there are many, many more recommendations. And our listeners, if you'd like to find a copy of that report, you can do so by visiting economicliberties.us. But before we let you go, Pat, as the report documents, there's also an incredible amount of work going on at the state level to take on corporate concentration. As director of state and local policy for your organization, what issues are driving an interest in this fight at the state and local level?
Absolutely. Tech is certainly one of them. We've seen a lot of communities pushing back against Amazon, particularly against subsidies for new Amazon warehouses and distribution networks. People at a sort of a gut level correctly feel that there's something very wrong with their taxpayer money going to subsidize the profits of a giant company that's making money hand over fist during the pandemic. Concerns about Facebook, concerns about the power that Apple and Google have over software developers. There's been a push in several states to try and regulate the ability that Apple and Google have to extract fees from every purchase that you make through an app store in an attempt to help sort of small developers and smaller tech companies. But it's not just the tech side, it's hospitals, big concerns about private equity rolling up hospital chains and physician groups and closing rural hospitals. It's agriculture. It obviously depends on the state, but there's been a broad recognition recently that corporations simply have too much power in our local communities. This isn't just some abstract federal thing where there need to be giant regulations at the federal level. This is affecting us on the ground every day. I've talked to folks out west who have seen firms come in and are rolling up their local tourism industry, buying up all the guiding permits and all the snowmobile shops and all the little local hotels. And suddenly a town is controlled by one company who can then use that power to, as we talked about earlier, cut worker pay or to push workers out or to demand that they make concessions during negotiations. So it certainly depends on the context, place to place. Everybody's local economy is different, but you see these broad trends playing out in community after community. And you've seen state and local lawmakers looking for solutions and trying to find ways to do something about it.
All right. Pat Garofalo, Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project. Again, author of The Billionaire Boondoggle, How Our Politicians Let Corporations and Bigwigs Steal Our Money and Jobs. Pat, it's great work you're doing. We appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Sounds great.
Thanks very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how the richest 1% keep their wealth out of sight and out of reach. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Oh, great. Here comes a new stealth attack on the fragile, life-sustaining natural resources of planet Earth. This assault is by Wall Street alchemists who are out to redefine one of our most basic resources, water. Everyone knows that water is invaluable. It's literally life, requiring a constant intake by each of us, or we quickly die. But the wizards of Wall Street want to reduce potable H2O from its environmental, humanitarian, and spiritual essence to just another perishable economic good that they can market price and sell to the highest bidder, literally turning our water into speculators' gold. This contrivance has opened the door for financial manipulators who've quietly been devising razzle-dazzle schemes to allow rich global investors to play in water. They're now pushing water futures, automated split-second trading, water-grabbing ventures, hedging schemes, and other financialization hustles to maneuver the monetary value of this essential resource. To see this ethically debased future, look to an outfit with the ominous acronym of WAM, Water Asset Management. It's buying up water rights in low-income farming communities in places like Arizona, then literally moving the commodity to rich suburban developments that will pay more. WAM profiteers call water peddling a $1 trillion market opportunity. They even boast that the devastation caused by climate change creates a market volatility that will provide an unprecedented period of transformation and investment opportunity for the water industry. This is Jim Hightower saying, let's begin to force a public discussion about this crucial question of environmental and existential ethics. Is access to an affordable supply of clean water to be a human right for all, or will we let it become a wet dream for a cabal of rich speculators? The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his newest book, Chuck Collins explores how the richest Americans are able to hide their wealth and pay next to no taxes, and how this is deepening our nation's economic divide. And we say hello to Chuck Collins, director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. He is the author of Born on Third Base, a one percenter makes the case for tackling inequality, bringing wealth home, and committing to the common good. And most recently, The Wealth Hoarders, how billionaires spend millions to hide trillions. Chuck Collins, welcome back to the America's Democrats Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. This new book is basically, it's about rich people hiding their wealth to avoid paying taxes. Social scientists call that wealth defense industry. Give us a sense of the scale of this problem. And so in terms of how much they pay in taxes, how do some of the millionaires and billionaires you write about compare to the rest of us?
Well, I think the scale is enormous. And I think it's important not to say this isn't just a sideshow to the economy. It's becoming very center stage. The estimate of wealth globally is somewhere between 24 and 36 trillion dollars, some 10 to 12% of the world's wealth. And so there's, huge impact in terms of loss of tax revenue. And this wealth defense industry that you mentioned, they are the hired help. They are sort of the enablers that facilitate this wealth vanishing act. They're the ones who have the tools and the expertise to create the trusts and offshore corporations and the like. And so effectively, they're shifting the taxes off of these very wealthy 30 million and up households onto the rest of us. And we know billionaire taxes have gone down significantly over the last couple decades, the share of their income that they pay in taxes.
This book is a remarkable deep dive into how the wealthy are able to hide their assets. One way is through real estate ownership. And that was a little bit of a surprise to me. How does real estate ownership advance this shell game? And what's the impact on, say, cities?
Well, when we think of like hidden wealth, we often think of like Caribbean islands, the Cayman Islands, or Bermuda and tax havens offshore. But actually, the money may be booked there, but it isn't there. It's actually in the real economy. And luxury real estate is a very attractive place to park wealth. And so we're seeing our cities now filled with luxury real estate, largely vacant, owned by shell companies, and is having a disruptive impact on local housing markets, particularly in the U.S. coastal cities. It's bidding up the cost of land and housing, and it's creating these sort of hollowed out neighborhoods. So it's one of the ways in which the hidden wealth touches down and affects the quality of our lives.
Man, there's always something new, some new way for these guys, or people, I shouldn't say guys, these people to do this, it seems. You also write about the use of offshore accounts, and that's not really new necessarily, but how widespread is the practice of using offshore accounts to hide wealth, and where do you see it most evident?
Well, it's a really important tool in the wealth hider's toolbox. Let's say, Jim, if you come to me with your $1 billion, what I do is I'd say, look, let's move some of it offshore. Let's bank it and put it in some banks here. Let's create some anonymous shell companies, and we'll kind of create some transactions that make it look like you're doing business and you're going to reduce your income taxes that way. So yes, the offshore is really an important part of this, but more and more, some of those things can be done onshore here in the United States. So you're seeing a lot of the hidden wealth from around the world now coming to the United States because we're a pretty stable marketplace to hold wealth and assets.
And Chuck, when it comes to the offshore accounts, I was under the impression that they were kind of hammering down on that and not allowing it as freely as they once did. Is that not really the case?
Well, I wouldn't say the United States is taking much of a role there, but the European Union countries are putting more pressure. Part of it was 5 years ago, the Panama Papers were published, which was that leak of that one law firm, but it revealed hundreds of thousands of these shell companies. And the European Union countries really did start to crack down on those secrecy jurisdictions, requiring greater transparency. The U.S. hasn't gotten into that yet. I hope we do, but it's still flourishing, the offshore system.
I hate to say it this way, but I guess money talks, right? I mean, that's their defense is the money that they're shelling, if you will. You make the point that the damage done by the wealth hoarding isn't just about fewer dollars going into the government coffers. So what's the broader picture on how to understand the impact of this hidden wealth?
Yeah, I think it's important to say it isn't just about tax avoidance. It's sort of about avoiding responsibility in lots of forms. So one of the things we've been noticing is, people who are hiding money from their ex-spouse because they're getting divorced, or kind of grifters who have ripped off their customers or malpractice or whatever. They've done things that they should be held accountable for, are not held accountable because they're taking their money and putting it in a asset protection trust in Belize or the Cook Islands. So tax dodging is one part of the problem, but it's also just about how the wealthy avoid responsibility for the things that the rest of us have to take responsibility for.
Almost sounds like we're talking about the former president. Just a little sidebar there from me. We're speaking to Chuck Collins, director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, and touching on his new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck, how do you understand the failure of our legal system to confront wealth hiding?
Part of it is that there is a powerful group of associations, the American Bar Association, the estate and trust section, these large accountancy groups. These are powerful groups that sort of have an interest in letting the status quo continue. They're the ones that sort of allow and enable this sort of double standards. They're the folks who are paid millions to hide trillions. So I think part of it is it's that, and part of it's complicated. It's these layers on layers of mind-numbing, complex trusts and mechanisms that are hard to explain and hard to oppose. And that these folks, complexity is the bread and butter of the wealth defense industry. So I think those are a couple of things that have made it challenging to fix this system.
It's funny as we're preparing for the interview and making the reference of a shell game and a shell game. But what you just described is the ultimate in shell game. That's just, you just keep moving the pieces around, confuse somebody to the point where they can't really fight it and they don't know anything about it. So they give up and off you go.
Yeah. And that is what the wealth defense industry does, is they create layers of ownership and complex. They may have each condominium, every luxury condominium is its own shell company. You have multiple bank accounts in multiple jurisdictions. If the heat gets turned up in one jurisdiction, you just shut down that account and move the money to another. It really is sort of a now you see it, now you don't kind of a system.
In terms of what can be done at the policy level to shut down the wealth defense industry, what are some of your key recommendations?
There's a couple things. One is enforcement. A lot of this could be taken care of if we had an oversight agency that was really monitoring it. Our Internal Revenue Service has just been decimated. It's had budget cuts, and it's also lost the expertise they need to sort of follow the money, do the kind of forensic accounting, be able to understand these complex dodges. So investing in enforcement on the tax dodges of the wealthy would reap huge benefits. Secondly, there are just certain kinds of trusts and business transactions and scams and things that should just be outlawed. Senator Sanders in his new estate tax reform bill basically proposes to make illegal certain kinds of trusts and tax scams. That's exactly what we should do. We should just say these are not allowed. They don't have any real economic purpose. Third thing is corporate transparency, just requiring corporations to disclose who their beneficiaries are. And finally, working together with other countries to kind of create treaties that require enforcement together across countries.
I wonder how little most people even know about this whole game, if you will, of wealth hiding, and how much that has in playing to keep it going. And it's supported because people just don't even know anything about it.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of why I wrote what I hope will be sort of a popular book, a popular accessible primer on how this works and why we should care. It's raising our tax bill. It's allowing grifters and kleptocrats to steal our money without consequence. It's leading to greater inequality and what I call inherited wealth dynasties, because these wealthy families are building up wealth and power. And that's not good for a healthy democratic society.
No, absolutely. Currently, there is a big debate in Washington over another way to confront wealth and taxes, and that is to increase taxes on corporations. President Biden has suggested hiking the corporate tax rate to 28%. Janet Yellen is calling for a minimum global corporate income tax. Are these solutions we need, and are they a reality that they can even happen?
Well, I think the system is in trouble. There are cracks in the system. There are even people working in the wealth defense industry who know it's wrong and are starting to defect. And I think, for instance, Federal Reserve Chair Yellen's proposal to have a global corporate minimum tax, what they're basically saying is let's have a treaty among the advanced industrial countries that there's a floor, and that these corporations can't pit countries against each other in a race to the bottom. And in order to do that, we'll have to shut down some of these hidden wealth games and infrastructure. So it's so in the interest of almost all these countries to come together and fix that. So I think there's pressure is just going to keep building to fix this. And I think it's entirely possible that 5 years from now, the rich are going to be paying more taxes and they're going to have less escape hatches. And that will be good for our societies.
I was just going to say, and then other people can enjoy things that they can't enjoy now that they work really hard for, and and I'm not talking about extravagant vacations. I'm talking about just your basic everyday life that you don't necessarily have money or access to the money that you need to enjoy that. So we can keep our fingers crossed. And if you want to learn a little bit more about this shell game, this wealth defense industry, I encourage you folks to check out the Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck Collins is the author. He's also the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. And of course, you've heard Chuck on this program many times in the past. Chuck, as always, we appreciate your time with us today and love to do it again soon.
Thanks for the conversation, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Kentucky Congressman John Yarmuth, head of the House Budget Committee, on the necessity of passing Biden's infrastructure plan.
I want to start with some recent breaking news. President Biden saying that 20 years in Afghanistan, we had achieved whatever we could achieve, and it's time to bring all American troops home. Did he do the right thing?
Oh, I think he did. As it is said very often, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. And that's what we've been doing for the balance of those 20 years. But even more so than that, I mean, the people, if you remember, those people who remember Charlie Wilson's war and think back to the Russian experience in Afghanistan and how disastrous that was for them and frustrating. So, we probably should have learned something from that experience. We didn't. And I certainly think the last 20 years kind of echoed that Russian experience. It's just a country that you can't accomplish much as a foreign influencer. So I think he did the right thing. I would have supported it if Obama had done it. I would have supported it if Trump had done it. So I'm glad that Joe Biden has finally decisively done it.
And one of the biggest challenges certainly now facing the congressman, and particularly with your role as the chair of the Budget Committee, Congressman, is the infrastructure bill, or as the White House calls it, the American Jobs Act, $2 trillion worth of improvements or public investment. What are the chances in the House? Any Republican votes at all, do you see?
Oh, I doubt it. It's amazing how people's positions change on things when they're not the party in power, and I say that for both parties. We were very big on the filibuster during the Trump years. We're not very big on it right now, but this is something that, strangely enough, Republicans are so much on the wrong side of the country on this, and it's just kind of, in a way, it's humorous. In a way, it's gratifying to hear them grasp for arguments against it. Mm-hmm. The notion that only 5% of this is infrastructure, because it's only 5% for roads and bridges, which is not accurate, by the way. There's $600 billion, or roughly a third of the entire package, is for conventional infrastructure. But the idea that Republicans don't think that the electric grid is infrastructure, that broadband's infrastructure, that electric charging stations aren't infrastructure, that an affordable system for child care and senior care is not part of infrastructure, is just a 19th century view of the country. And it just is not relevant to today's world. As I've said on many occasions the last few weeks, if a woman can't get to her job because she can't find affordable care for her kids, or for a parent or grandparent she's taking care of, then that's just as much of an impediment as not being able to take public transportation. So, again, we just need to rethink, and we are, and I think the Biden administration has rightly defined infrastructure in a much more expansive way, and I think that's appropriate. So I'm thrilled with the package. When I heard about it the first time and they briefed us and went through it point by point, I said, wow, this is such a coherent plan. It all makes sense together. Mm-hmm. And with the underlying theme of doing something that will help with climate change. And I just think it's truly could be a transformative package for the country. And, I look forward to passing it. It's not going to be easy, but next few months will tell.
But in conversations with your Republican colleagues, they have to have projects, roads, bridges, sewage treatment plants, or whatever in their districts that they know need updating or repairing or fixing, right? I mean,
of course. And what's, again,
so what do they tell you about that?
Well, they just don't right now. Well, first of all, the corporate tax rate as a means of paying for it is something that they all are defensive about.
Yeah.
But, they freely admit that. And what is, again, gratifying from my perspective is that you hear Republican mayors, Republican county executives, Republican governors all say we desperately need this, as they did with the American Rescue Plan. So right now, congressional Republicans are the only people who are on the other side of the issue. And I think they're just out on a limb and will, with a lot of people with saws behind them waiting to cut it off.
Well, politically, right? That's what I question politically. If there's an opening for a new bridge, they'll want to be there at the ribbon cutting, right? but they're
exactly.
But they're voting against it.
Right. We have a project that is desperately needed, not just in Kentucky, but and it's not in my district, but throughout that part of the country, a bridge that goes across the Ohio at Cincinnati. It's called the Brent Spence Bridge. It is in very serious danger. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama made a trip there while he was president to talk about the need to do something about that bridge. And this is, it's 2 Republican states. We have a Democratic governor, but it's a Republican state. 2 heavily Republican districts on either side of the river. But they desperately need it. But more than that, this is I-75 corridor. It's the I-71 corridor. This is one of the major commerce routes and highways in the country. And this is the type of project that the American Jobs Act will help get done. And it's, again, desperately needed. Republicans are crying for it. And it's amazing to hear Republicans in Congress. And Steve Chabot's the Republican congressman from Cincinnati. I haven't really heard him specifically on it, but it'll be interesting to see what he and Portman and Thomas Massey, who's the congressman on my side of the river, how they regard this project. Because, the citizens desperately need it.
Do you think some of them may come around, given pressure from some of their local districts, their mayors or governors?
Well, it didn't matter on the American Rescue Plan, that's for sure, right. They were lobbied heavily by their mayors. I think if they take the corporate tax pay for away, then maybe some of them will change their minds. I think that's going to be the critical decision for some of them, but I still don't think we're going to get many Republicans to vote for it regardless.
Well, there are enough Democratic votes in the House. If all the Democrats hold together, of course, they can get through the House. The Senate is always the bigger problem. Senator Coons has come forth with a proposal, Congressman, I don't know whether you've seen yet, that he's suggesting that we could split the Jobs Act into what everybody would agree is infrastructure, right?
Right.
Like $800 billion worth, and do that as a 60-vote bill, and then do the rest of the stuff, like you mentioned, broadband or electric grid. You and I would argue that that is infrastructure, but if they say it's not, put all of those other things like the child care, the home care for the elderly in and do that through reconciliation. Is that a way to go, do you think?
I don't think so. No, I think that's a mistake. That's, it's analogous to the issue of immigration reform. You can do the easy stuff's easy to do on a bipartisan basis. The more difficult stuff's not. So what we would have is, the Republicans would take all the credit for all those ribbon cuttings, as you mentioned, and then they would destroy us for our heavy-handedness in doing Green New Deal projects. I mean, that's exactly what would happen. And if I were in their shoes, that's the way I would do it. So I just think that's too convenient for Republicans, and it puts us at a real disadvantage in terms of messaging.
It's interesting. I hadn't intended to ask you about this, but you reminded me. You used the phrase immigration reform. It wasn't that long ago, Congressman, you were part of the I forget what, the Gang of 15 or whatever it was called. It was
the Gang of 8.
Gang of 8 in the House on immigration reform. Right. Nobody talks about that anymore.
No, and it's sad. Going back then, we were the Senate actually passed a bipartisan bill in the spring of 2013. I think there were 17 or 18 Republicans who voted for it. We had come to an agreement after 7 months of negotiation. And in the Gang of 8, we were confident that we had a bill that would pass the House with 250 or 60 votes, and we couldn't get John Boehner to bring it to the floor. And it's a tragedy because much of what we're experiencing today would have been solved again almost 8 years ago if he had done that. And at the time, this is meaningless history now, but Bob Goodlatte was chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and Bob was very much opposed to comprehensive immigration reform because he had watched Eric Cantor, the then majority leader, lose his seat in the primary over immigration, and at least that was the narrative. And so he was paranoid about doing anything with immigration, but John Boehner would not go around him. And again, that's very unfortunate because we had a bill we knew could pass, and we knew that it was something that could that we could conference relatively easily because we crafted it in a way that we knew it would satisfy the Senate as well. So it's too bad, but again, the thought then was there's certain parts of immigration reform that are really easy, and there's some that are really hard, and that's why you don't separate them.
Right. One final question on the corporate tax. As you mentioned, the Republicans have basically said, no way, no how are we going to support any increase in taxes. But isn't it a catch-22, Congressman? Because if you said, okay, well, then we'll just add this borrow, right, and add to the deficit, then they're against that too, right?
Exactly.
Right. So
exactly. Yeah, it doesn't concern me that if we were, of all the things we could spend money on and not pay for it, infrastructure is the best thing to do because it does pay for itself over time. And the most every analysis says that that every dollar spent on infrastructure returns $1.50, and more importantly than that, it provides a foundation for the economy of the future, and we desperately need to do that. So I'm fine doing it without having a pay for. I think there are probably too many Democrats who would not agree with me on that, and so I'm not sure we could do it that way. But the question of the corporate tax rate, in any sense of equity, you look at a company like Amazon, made $30 billion in profit. They paid 1.2% federal tax last year, 0% the 2 years before that. Their entire business is predicated on infrastructure. FedEx, I don't think, paid any federal tax. Their entire business is infrastructure. So to ask these corporations to, by the way, pay a rate that they would have been thrilled with in 2017 is not so much of a burden. And the executives I've talked to aren't really concerned about that. They say, yeah, take us to 25, take us to 28. It's fine. We'll deal with it. And they didn't ask for 21% in 2017, by the way. The corporations didn't.
Right. I mean, it's not like they're paying anywhere close to 21%, right? Or 28%.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And, the Republicans say, well, this will hurt small businesses. Well, that's nonsense because small businesses don't pay corporate tax. The vast majority of them are what's called subchapter S corporation, and the profits pass through to them as individuals, and they pay at individual rates. So this wouldn't have any impact on the vast majority of small businesses.
Is the bottom line here that the really basis for the opposition is they just don't want Joe Biden to accomplish anything, just like they didn't? Okay, I might as well. I'd just put that out there.
Yeah, of course that's the bottom line, and. Again, maybe they don't believe in polls, but you look at every poll out there, and they're swimming upstream against public opinion. That's for sure.
For sure. On the tax question, Congressman, one thing that is not in the president's plan is something that's been talked about a lot, and that is the so-called SALT issue, right? The state and local tax exemption thing that Donald Trump did away with. Any chance of that coming back?
I don't know. There's not unanimity among Democrats to do away with the SALT deduction, and because
it's pretty popular among the American people, right? I mean,
it's pretty popular among the American people. It is kind of the provision.
I always liked it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I won't say it's killing me, but it's certainly doing away with the SALT deduction is certainly affecting me in a negative way. And because we have a property tax in Kentucky and we have a state income tax, and I have too much real estate and I'm paying a lot of property taxes, and I can only deduct a small percentage of that. So, but, it is a regressive proposition because the deduction does disproportionately affect wealthier people. So true liberals should say, and many of them do, don't do away with it. But then you have a lot of true liberals in New York and California who are adversely affected by eliminating the deduction, and they're kind of torn.
So the answer may be a cap as to how much.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine. I will not name him, but he's been a friend of mine for most of my life, and he's a very, very high-placed in the financial world in New York. And he said, the people I know are much more concerned about the SALT deduction than they are about tax rates. He said you can increase their top marginal rate on their income. You can put the SALT deduction back in, but you can raise the corporate tax, but the SALT deduction is the biggest killer for them.
Bill Press with Congressman John Yarmuth, chair of the House Budget Committee. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit billpresspods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Pat Garofalo, Chuck Collins, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.